tuning in to the World XP podcast. If you're enjoying the content, please remember to drop a sub, drop a like, and leave your thoughts down below in the comments. With that, we will see you guys in the podcast. Welcome, Steve, to the World XP podcast. We've been playing email tag, and obviously you've been refueling your reactor, which I still don't know what that means, but that's what I know you've been doing. So it's been a little while. We've been playing email tag, and now we're here. So if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit, I know we might touch on the gymnastics stuff potentially, but go ahead and introduce yourself and welcome.
All right. So I'm Steve Hamm. I'm a nuclear engineer by degree, although I've technically never been a nuclear engineer by trade. I work for the largest green energy company in the United States. They're the largest producer of carbon-free electricity in the United States. I currently work at a nuclear power plant in the Midwest. I have my senior reactor operator's license that I received from the U.S. government, from the NRC, in 2016. I currently bounce back and forth between planning outages and running a nuclear reactor from the control room as a unit supervisor.
So we were just chatting beforehand, and so I have a very rudimentary understanding of how I'll say, can we still call them alternative? Or maybe the non-fossil fuel energy sources kind of go. So like where they get it from, and then from coal, it's like you boil it and then it's steam into a turbine, although that's kind of less clean. But so can you sort of go through and explain how the nuclear side works? Because I think it's a difficult conceptually. People hear nuclear power and they think Chernobyl and three-headed horses and all sorts of other things.
Yeah, so most people have a rudimentary understanding, at least, of how a power plant works. That you boil water, that water creates steam, and you turn a turbine, which turns a turbine generator and creates electricity. Nuclear power in the United States, at least, and most places across the world outside of advanced reactor designs that we really don't use outside of research, operate the same way. But instead of burning fossil fuels to create for your heat source, we use nuclear fission. So you have you have a neutron, which splits a uranium-235 atom that splits off into its daughter parts and releases energy. That energy is utilized to boil water. Boiling that water creates steam, which will then turn the turbine, and that turns the turbine generator and creates electricity. So that's kind of your base level. It works the same way as a coal plant would in that sense.
So when you're talking the reactor and to the steam, and one of the things you mentioned beforehand as well was that it's a closed loop. And so a lot of times we hear about power plants creating waste. What are the stipulations, I guess, of creating electricity in this fashion that would, I don't know, again, coming from, I don't really understand how it works, but I've seen, there's a lake in Virginia called Lake Anna, and there's a power plant there, and stuff kind of spews out from the power plant into the lake a little bit, which is always fun. Makes the water warm, which I guess is nice. It might be a nuclear, I don't know.
But it's North Anna. It is a nuclear power plant there in Virginia on Lake Anna.
Yeah. So how does the waste side of things work?
So there's two things that generally people think of when they think of waste. Usually people think of waste in nuclear power. They think of spent fuel. And that does exist. That is a byproduct of nuclear power. After so much of the uranium-235 inside the reactor has been burned, the fuel can no longer be utilized. It can't sustain the nuclear chain reaction anymore. And that's what that refueling outage is that you kind of touched on in the intro. That's where those come into play. So we will then, once the plant that I work at is on a 2-year cycle, there's 2 units. So once a year, we're refueling one of the units. And so we take the top off, we go in, we shuffle the fuel around to make sure it's in the configuration we want. And then the fuel that's spent, which is usually some percentage, usually it's a third of the fuel, gets removed from the reactor, and then a third of the new fuel gets put in. And that fuel that we removed that is burnt and can no longer sustain a nuclear chain reaction is stored in fuel pools locally on site until some level of heat decay, because what's unique about nuclear power is that after the fuel is removed and the nuclear chain reaction is stopped, there's still energy inside those fuel sources. They still produce heat, which is why you have to store them in a fuel pool while they decay away. They hit a certain level, and then we store them in what we call dry cask storage, which then you transfer those over to these giant concrete structures where you store move the fuel into those. They fill them, then they vacuum seal them. There's a whole process there, and then they get stored out locally on pads. Right now, across the United States, as you know, Yucca Mountain was never completed fully, and so right now, any nuclear power plant in the United States stores their spent fuel on site. Now, the plant I work at came online in the 80s, and all the spent fuel that we've ever had sits on site in a concrete pad, roughly the size of a football field, and it's nowhere near even full yet. So in the 30 some years that the plant's been running and making electricity, we still store all our fuel on site. So that's one waste that people think of, and that waste will stay radioactive. Now, it can be stored safely. Those canisters that are tested to the most extreme conditions that you could imagine. And so they're stored locally on site until we find a future storage solution that everybody can come to agreement. There's a lot of politics involved with that I won't get into with just this, unless you got more questions, which you might, but then I might get into it. And then the other waste people think is releases. So a lot of people think of nuclear power and they think of the big cooling towers, the Homer Simpson, that kind of thing. And what people don't understand is those cooling towers are just big cloud generators. All they're doing is you're taking your circ water, which is used to as a ultimate heat sink for your condenser, because you got to condense that steam that you're creating back into water after it spins your turbine. And so that's only a cooling medium. So it pumps that water through those cooling towers and uses ambient air to cool that water. And then what you see coming out there is essentially the moisture being the condensation happening, being pulled into the cooling medium, and they're just producing clouds. That's all that is. It's just a big cloud generator. In fact, if you look at states like Indiana, which doesn't have any nuclear power outside of the research reactor at Purdue University, just had to give that a little shout out. They have those on at coal plants as well. And you look, you're like, oh, that must be a nuclear power plant. Nah, a cooling tower is just a cooling medium. Every power plant that runs on a steam cycle needs an ultimate heat sink. It's no different for nuclear power. So that's what you see there. And then the other one you had mentioned is like Lake Anna in Virginia. A lot of nuclear power plants use a ultimate heat sink that is a lake or the ocean. And you mentioned making the water warm, and that's because you're pumping water in through. It goes through your condenser just like it would on a coal plant. It then transfers that heat from your steam cycle into that and pumps it back out to the lake. And there's no byproducts. You're not actually pumping water that went through the reactor out to the lake. You're just pumping water that came from the lake. It goes through your condenser and then goes back to your lake. And all you did was heat that water up. And that's why lakes like Lake Anna stay warmer year round, and you end up getting really big fish. People like to say, hey, the big fish, that must be from nuclear. Right now, that's just because you keep the lake warm so the fish can grow bigger.
Yeah. So how does that work then? So they pump, so like my brain is trying to so like when the water comes in from the lake, for instance, what is it cooling exactly that doesn't touch the rest of the reaction or whatever plant it's in? Like, how does that mechanism work?
Yeah, so your condenser has hundreds and thousands of tubes in it. And so you pump the cool water from your lake inlet or ocean inlet or whatever, river inlet. Some plants use rivers, and that goes through those tubes and then back out. And then your steam, like I mentioned, in a boiling water reactor, that water is boiled right inside the reactor, and so it is radioactive steam. So that steam goes through, spins your turbine, and then goes down into your condenser, and that steam gets pushed down on top of those tubes where it condenses back into water. And so that process is kept separate because you have your cooling medium coming from your lake or your river or your ocean going to those tubes, and then your energy from the steam hits those tubes, condenses, and cools down. So the two are separate at all times.
Well, that's good to know, because otherwise I'd have a third head.
You implied that you have a second head.
Yeah, I don't know where I was going with that. Never mind. All right, moving on. So the other part I wanted to touch on real quick before we get into your background, and then sort of the more the generalities around how the power, like how the sort of power ecosystem is changing, is you're talking about nuclear engineering. What does that actually entail, right? Because you have the reaction within the plant that creates the heat, but what is the engineering that's done? Like what, like when you say nuclear engineer, what is that?
So, like I kind of mentioned, I am a nuclear engineer by degree, but never
Yeah.
by trade. I was never actually employed as a nuclear engineer. But as you go through college, the engineering side of it has to do with the physics behind the nuclear reaction. So, going through college, you do a lot of the same stuff that you see in mechanical or electrical engineers do. You learn the mechanical cycles, how the various plants work, and the physical mechanisms behind those. And then you get into the nuclear specific. How does a chain reaction work? What sustains it? What are the physics that go into it? You get into some quantum theory there, nuclear physics, that kind of stuff. What sustains the reaction? Why does it occur? And that kind of thing. So that's the engineering side. And if you were to take that into a profession, what the nuclear engineers do, a lot of it goes into fuel design, how you design the fuel to best transfer heat off the fuel, how to pack the uranium or the fuel, any fuel source in there in the most efficient manner that's going to help you produce energy, that kind of thing. And then the core design. A lot of the nuclear engineering has to go with the core design because it matters. The placement of the different fuel bundles, the enrichments of the various fuel bundles, the burn rate of the various fuel bundles, how long it's been in the core when you shuffle it around each refueling outage, and how you do that to maintain an even power distribution. That's a big part of design in a nuclear core, is maintaining that energy production even throughout the core. Because if you don't place those, you could get power peaks in various parts of the reactor, which you don't want. You want to maintain that flux profile as flat as possible. And then also, I want to put enough fuel in the vessel so it can run for the 2 years that it needs to run. We call it a breaker to breaker run. So you close the breaker and start producing electricity at the end of the outage, and you don't want to open that breaker back up until you start your refueling outage 2 years later. So the design to say, this is the amount of fuel I want in there, and then the cost basis for, I'm going to run for 2 years. So this is how much fuel I want to put in there. So I want to burn as much of it as possible. So I enter a period that we call coast down, where essentially you're throttled full open. It's like you got the gas all the way down and you're running out of gas, and you just coast down into that refueling outage. So you had a cost effectiveness there, that you burned as much of the fuel as possible. And so that's what the nuclear engineering aspect looked at. You could also get into, I mean, if power production isn't what you're looking at, is reactor design. So you have advanced reactors. There's been a lot of talk in innovation space. Bill Gates has his company that's looking at small modular reactors. That's like the next big thing in nuclear power. 10, 15 years ago, when I got into when I was like, oh, I'm gonna get into nuclear energy. That's what I want to do. It was new build. You've got your plant down in Georgia, Vogtle, which is an AP1000. Your big dinosaur, big giant reactors. That was the big thing before Fukushima happened, was new build. But now we're moving away from some of the larger reactors based on cost and cost effectiveness, and looking at these small modular reactors and how they have more passive safety systems, that kind of stuff. So you could get, an nuclear engineer could get involved in something like that, reactor design, or you could even get into medical isotope production. A guy I used to work with who left the company that I work at. Oh, sorry, I got to stop my timer here. Hey,
You're
Google,
good.
stop. That was the timer I set to remind myself to jump on this at noon Central Time.
Yeah. Time zones.
And so you could get into, he left and does medical isotope production. So he works in a particle accelerator to create medical isotopes for cancer treatments and that kind of stuff. You could also get into nuclear fusion, working at like ITER or Argonne National Labs, that kind of stuff. So there is a lot of branches where you could branch off and look at different things. I just happen to go into energy production and work at a utility.
Gotcha. So I had a guy named Garrett on the podcast. He's a quantum physicist, and one of the things that he was talking about was particle accelerators and other things. And my brain is trying to get into the same sort of mindset that I was in talking to him, because he was talking about like teleporting and other wild things. But from one of the things he was talking about was like how the different particles can make, like the particle accelerators, and then We touched a little bit on fusion versus fission, and what is the difference exactly? Or, oh, well, generally.
So they're kind of opposite phenomenons. If you think of fission is breaking, you're utilizing the energy that is stored inside of the uranium atoms by breaking it apart and releasing that energy. And so you use that to boil water. Where fusion is the opposite. You're going to take two hydrogen atoms usually, and you smash them together. And when you smash them together, they fuse. And when they do fuse, that releases a substantial amount of energy, which is actually much greater than the energy released in a fission reaction. And the other part of that is the byproduct of smashing two hydrogen atoms together is water. So you don't have the radioactive byproduct as much with a fusion reaction as you do. To compare power sources, God, I hate to do this, but I'll compare the two most common things that people think of when they think of nuclear energy is bombs. So the original nuclear bomb, Fat Man and Little Boy, that was dropped on Japan to end World War II, those are fission bombs. And then if you look at like the megaton yield of some of the nuclear weapons that we have now, they're hydrogen bombs. They're actually not nuclear bombs anymore. They're fusion bombs. And that technology is actually fusing of atoms together to release that energy. So if you look at the megaton yield versus nuclear weapons when they came into this world and what the capability of them is now, that's kind of your difference in magnitude of power capabilities of fission versus fusion. And then just the cleaner nature of fusion in general. But mankind we haven't quite gotten there yet. We're close, but we're not quite there yet to harness the atom in that way for energy production.
Yeah, so that was going to be the next question are we, because all the ones now are still fission. So when you talk about going from fission to fusion to create energy, but also to make the reactors smaller, what is the science that goes into that? Because I would say, right, obviously it's an atom, so you can't see it, but the size of the reactor, at least when they were built back in like the 70s and 80s, needed to be big to kind of house the reaction, I guess. What sort of like what I know what I'm trying to ask in my head. I'm not sure how to word it properly. I guess the question is, what made it so that the reactor, like the thing that housed the reaction, needed to be so big then? And then if fusion is more powerful than fission, are we going towards both at the same time? Do you know what I'm trying to ask or no?
Yeah, I think I understand. So I think your question is kind of twofold. It's one, you look at, and I mentioned it kind of briefly when I talked about the nuclear rebuild or new build that was popular before the accident at Fukushima a decade ago now. And so that it really has to do with how much energy you want to produce. The big baseload plants produce on the order of like gigawatts of power, where you're looking at these small modular reactors. They can be designed for smaller outputs. Think like military bases, or they could be utilized for small power production. Like I know there was an article out the other day that Purdue University is working with Duke Energy to possibly bring a small modular reactor to West Lafayette, Indiana, to power the campus in the local area. So it can be used in smaller municipalities, and then they can be geared towards what you need. So you could actually chain several of these small modular reactors together on a site, and then you're producing, once that power hits the grid, you're producing gigawatts of power. And then the smaller, one of the great things about the design of the new small modular reactors is the safety systems are more passive. Because it's smaller, they rely more on natural recirculation, stuff like that, where you don't need these big pumps and turbines and stuff like that for safety systems. The safety systems are passive. So you don't need energy or electricity to run the safety systems. Where you look at the large reactors, the PWRs and BWRs that exist now in the United States, a lot of them have diesel generators and large pumps for their safety systems in the event of an accident that you would utilize, where these small modular reactors eliminate those from the equation. It's just one less piece that could possibly go wrong in the event of an accident.
When you talk about modular, that could mean a lot of different things for a lot of different systems. How, when they say they were going to move one to Indiana, how big, like what size are you talking about
I
for
mean,
one of
you're
those?
still looking at it's gonna still have a footprint like an industrial area would. It's just much smaller than the footprint you see in in the power plants that we have running now. And then the modular piece is just because you can put more than one on one site to meet your power production needs, whatever you need. So if it's you only need, I think to put in perspective, I think the modular reactor that Bill Gates' company is working on is somewhere in the order of like 200 to 350 megawatts per reactor. The plant I work at produces 1.21 gigawatts per reactor, and we're a 2-unit site. So just the amount of power produced is much larger in the current reactors, and you can scale that down with the modular, but you can have multiple ones on site to scale up to that level of power if that's what your needs are based on where you're building these.
Gotcha. All right, so we're back. Technical difficulties. We're talking about the modular power plants versus the big ones and sort of the amount of energy that it creates. And real quick, so I have an understanding, but also so everybody else has an understanding. When you talk about like kilowatts of power, to put that into like a perspective where somebody can understand, like what is a kilowatt of power? What is that able to power? Like what are you able to do with that level of energy?
So to put it in perspective, the site I work with, let me see if I can look up real quick the exact number so I don't lie to you. I'll keep it memorized, but I believe the site I work with, like I said, it's 2 units, 2 identical units, both 1200 megawatt. That's the electricity output. That's not the thermal output, because obviously you're dealing with the efficiency of a steam cycle. Yeah, and so both that's 2 1200 megawatt unit sites, and that produces enough electricity, carbon-free electricity, to power 2.3 million homes.
Whoa.
And so that's kind of what you're looking at when you're looking at, and remember that's megawatts. So you're talking an order of magnitude greater than looking at kilowatts. And if you look at like your microwave, it's like 1,000 watts. Usually when you look at a microwave, look at the little rating on the inside of your door.
So in these modular ones are in the kilowatt range.
They're in the megawatt range. They still produce a lot of electricity. You're talking megawatt range. Some of them, depending on which design you're looking at, because there's several companies that are looking at designing these. GE is designing some, like I said, TerraPower, Bill Gates' company. Rolls-Royce is currently trying to design small modular reactors in the UK. And so they range anywhere from 50 megawatts up to like 350 to 450 megawatts.
So given everything that happened with Russia and Ukraine and the discussion about the dependency on different power sources, and Germany has shut down their nuclear power plants, I think it was them. What are the, so for me, when everything that I hear very little downside to nuclear power as an energy source, aside from obviously you'd want to prevent the notable accidents that everybody knows about, but also those are older plants that I would think we have mitigated a lot of the potential issues that those came with. So what are some of the what's the downsides that why is this not more widespread? Is it we as a society aren't used to the idea of nuclear, or what's in your perspective, what's going on with because it doesn't seem to be, it's like a I don't want to use the term fringe, but people don't really, as you always hear about wind and solar and hydro for the most part, and not and nuclear is kind of like, well, maybe, but we should do these other ones instead. And that doesn't make sense to me.
So I'll try to be as unbiased in my answer as possible, because based on the fact that I'm a nuclear
Yeah,
engineer and I work at a nuclear power plant, that definitely influences that. My opinion shows
sure.
right there based on my profession. But I think there's a couple reasons why. First off, it's the way nuclear energy was introduced to us as a society, as a species. I mean, you think of nuclear anything and you immediately think of weapons. You think of the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You think of the Cold War, you think of the arms race, you think of nuclear weapons testing, non-proliferation. That's where everybody's mind goes initially. That's the way that uh, this technology was introduced to the world, was through death and destruction on a scale that is unparalleled still to this day. And so it goes back there. That's where people's brains go, and I can't fault people for that. You don't think of solar. You don't think about a solar energy and thinking about two cities getting wiped off the face of the earth. And so I won't discount people's feelings
Sure.
when they think about that, because that would be doing them a disservice. And then I think as an industry, we've done a very poor job of advertising that, hey, this is different. This is not the same technology. These plants don't blow up in a nuclear fashion. It's not the same. People think about they'll look at the explosion from Chernobyl or Fukushima, and those weren't nuclear explosions. Fukushima wasn't, at least. Um, and so I think that has a little bit to do with it. But to say it's a fringe power source, it's really not. 20% of the electricity in the United States is produced by nuclear power. So that's a fifth of all electricity production in the United States. And you think of the different forms, you mentioned the other green forms: solar, wind, hydro, which actually can be incredibly destructive to an ecosystem. Um, but that doesn't even count natural gas, oil, coal, and the other ones that produce tons of electricity. So we're still 1/5 of all the electricity produced in the United States, and so that's really not a fringe. And um, it's always been in my opinion that nuclear power fission reaction is not actually the ultimate solution to to global warming, or it's not going to be the energy source that we use as a society forever moving forward. But it is the best and only stopgap we have to produce large baseload energy from where we're at now until wind and solar can pick up more of that baseload. It's cliche at this point, but the sun doesn't always shine and the wind doesn't always blow, and battery storage isn't there yet. It's not where it needs to be to power baseload, because you can power homes, but you're not going to be able to power steel mills and factories and that kind of stuff. Um, and it needs to be there for that transition until another power source like fusion becomes a viable power source. And then eventually, I think sometime in the next 100 to 300 years, you will see fission phased out as a power source, as renewables become more efficient and fusion becomes a viable power source.
Well, yeah, it's really a function of the battery capabilities, though. I feel like the storage of the batteries, because until we're able to store enough to where, like, if we have a bunch of cloudy days in a row, that everybody doesn't lose power. Like, we're not really, for solar specifically. Obviously, there's other ones, but I think I was listening to Elon talk about it, like on some interview. That, I mean, he does tons of interviews, but he was just saying like how I think he thought that battery technology would be further along by now than it was, and there's some I don't know if it was one of the, I think it was lithium. Like there's a shortage of lithium, or to be able to get the minerals needed to like really do that. I don't really know.
Yeah, it takes a lot of rare earth metals for those high capacity batteries, and you also have to look at where those materials exist at. A lot of them are in contested parts of the world, or become reliant on countries that you might not want to become reliant on for those materials. I mean, look at what's happening with the energy crisis in Europe right now with the war in Ukraine. You could have similar conflicts in the future based on the resources needed for batteries. The other piece that people don't think about is the waste that battery production creates. There's quite a bit of very toxic waste that is produced when these high capacity, high storage density batteries are created. And so that's going to create another problem that we'll have to figure out how to store and use. It's just not as widespread. It's not as known as much of the waste that creates. So yeah, battery capacity will get better, but that'll create its own next set of problems. But that's going to be true about any energy source that we end up creating outside of fusion energy, since
Yeah.
the power source for a fusion reactor is water. That's where
Yeah.
you pull the hydrogen from.
Yeah, for sure. What's odd to me is when I sit on the sidelines and like I try and stay a little bit informed of energy stuff going on just because of I feel like it's good to know about these sorts of things. Um, but the broader discussion is doesn't seem to be as like cooperative as I would think from the standpoint of like as a society, right? We're like people will discount one instead of saying, "Hey, we'll use it until we can get a better version of this other thing." It's like instead of pushing, for example, like, okay, yeah, we'll use fission until wind and solar have the battery capacity to really be able to take that over, so we don't have this risk or that risk. Like, there's not really that discussion. Like, this is you saying this now is the first time that I've heard of that perspective on energy. I guess it's not on policy. I guess policy as a whole, and that's something that I hadn't really crossed my mind before. And that's super interesting. I guess there's not really a question involved with this, but it's just an observation that I guess what are your thoughts on that? Or like, do you are you observing the energy discussion as a whole as well, or are you kind of more in your like nuclear sort of not I guess bubble for lack of a better word?
Yeah, I mean, I try to pay attention to energy policy as a whole, and like the direction that the planet's going, because we do need to get off of fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Um, whatever that ends up looking like in the future, whether it's expanded nuclear, which I think is, like I said, required as a stopgap to get us from point A to point B, as its solar gets more efficient and prices come down. Right now, what a lot of people don't know, there's massive subsidies on wind and solar, to keep them competitive, and so we get those technologies where those aren't required. Um, and so I definitely keep track of like energy policy. I think actually recently there seems to be a shift in public perception for energy policy, people becoming more aware. I think climate change has become less and less of a hot point. You see more agreement. You hear less argument about it. You still hear some, but I think there's pretty widespread agreement that, hey, we're causing damage to this planet, and we've got to find a way to stop. And so any piece of technology, any energy production that's required to get us off of fossil fuels is going to have a place in the future of energy production. I just think nuclear is going to be a very large part of that for the near and short, for the short term as well as some long term, because you have to have energy diversity as well. If you put all your eggs in one basket, you're gonna end up having problems later, because something's gonna happen. You're gonna end up finding some kind of fault somewhere. So energy diversification is a huge thing that we need to be looking at outside of just what we're using to produce that energy.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's true of most things to not have your eggs all in one basket. Um, but I think, yeah, like the climate change discussion used to be like, no, it's not happening. And then it would be like, you're a conspiracy theorist or like all these like things that were thrown around. And the discussion now seems to be more as like, I think everybody accepts that we need to get off fossil fuels, but it's just a matter of like how much are humans actually doing versus if humans are doing like damage to it. I think is more the discussion now, and of course that's difficult as well to kind of determine because there's so many variables that go into it. um but yeah, energy policy is super fascinating to me because I don't understand it really, and there's a right way to there's a right solution for a lot of problems that if you take in, like, for example, you could have a problem and you could have a solution, but if policy, like if and it could be right for one group of people, but when you're making policy, you have to consider everyone. And so that is like, that becomes difficult. Like solar, for instance, in Texas is way more viable than solar up in like Maine, where it's like cloudy and stuff all the time. So like policy to create policy for the whole country on that is super interesting. And so that for me is where, like, when I listen to people discuss it in my head, I'm like, oh, I feel like nuclear would just work in both places. so, so I don't know. Like, I don't know. I feel like, I don't know. I feel like energy policy should be pushing more and like have more nuclear in it. But also, I'm not versed, so I don't know if like it is, and I'm just wrong. But I don't know. I mentioned this earlier, and you said I was preaching to the choir. So,
Yeah, I mean, you are. Like I said, I think I used this in one of my job interviews. You don't. I got my degree is in nuclear engineering. You don't pigeonhole yourself with a degree like that if you don't have a belief in the technology.
yeah.
And so I wouldn't have gotten that degree if I didn't think nuclear was a large part of where the direction we need to go as a planet for our energy production needs, because the amount of energy we need that need to be produced to meet our daily needs is only going to go up exponentially. We are all fortunate to live in the United States, where you don't worry about whether your lights are going to turn on or not. But you look at some of the growth countries, their power needs are going to go up exponentially. If you look at China and India as an example, their power needs are going to explode in the next 10, 50, 100 years. And you're going to need something to meet that base load power need. And you're going to need to do it without pumping things into the atmosphere. You're going to need to be able to do that without continuing to cause damage to the planet. And I think, I mean, China's already doubled down on nuclear energy. They're producing more. They're building more new plants than anybody here. And if we get behind on that, you also are going to run into a nuclear security or a national security issue, in my opinion. So it's very complicated, and I can't begin to say I am an expert in any of that in public policy or anything. I just see a future where we're going to have to have hard discussions about what directions we're going for our energy needs, and we're going to have to let the emotion of public opinion, we're going to have to let that go at some point and realize as a society we have a direction we have to move, and we've got to start moving in that direction, or we're going to find out it's too late real soon.
Yeah, and even sub-Saharan Africa, like even after India and China come, they're probably next. And so it's not gonna, the increased need for electricity and power is not really gonna stop anytime soon, is if we move more towards like electric cars. But then if we end up with electric planes and like other stuff, like it's just never gonna end the need for more. And so yeah, but we definitely don't want to be behind on that, because that's, well, being behind on something like that, like you said, national security as well, but just like the potential unrest that could come up, like could pop up from something like that is, I'm just envisioning it now. I'm not.
I feel like we're heading to a really dark place right now. I feel like.
Yeah, we can, you guys at home can envision that for yourselves, and we're going to go somewhere else with this. So you mentioned you got your degree in nuclear engineering. We're kind of going backwards a little bit with the timeline. Most of the time, start with how somebody got into what they're doing, and then talk about the nuances of what they're doing afterwards. This time we talked about the nuances first, and now we're going to go. So how did you get into it? You mentioned beforehand that your dad had been doing it for forever, but sort of walk us through the interest level. What sort of piqued your interest, right? Because my dad was doing stuff and with civil engineering, and I was like, yeah, I don't really want to do that. So something must have sparked for you at that point to still want to do it.
Yeah, let's Tarantino this. Let's take it back to the beginning.
Yeah.
So first, it started with like an interest. I knew I was interested in math and in science. I had a talent for it growing up. I wasn't really challenged in grade school or high school or anything like that. And it kind of started. I had no idea what an engineer was, what an engineer did, or if that was even a career path that I could take. I was aware of nuclear power. Like I said, my dad's worked at a nuclear power plant for his entire career. And so I knew it existed, but not in my wildest dreams at that point was that what I wanted to do. My interest in engineering actually started my sophomore year in high school. I had a chemistry teacher. We had an essay one time where we had to pick a point in history that she wanted it to be semi like confrontational kind of thing, like take an opinion on something, and we were learning about like neutrons and electrons and stuff like that. And so I wrote an essay about why the use of nuclear weapons in World War II actually saved lives. And to get into that, it's because the ground war, I mean, this is totally off topic, but my point was that the ground war that would have ensued in Japan would have cost more civilian lives based on Japanese total war, that the way they were fighting at that point in World War II would have ended up causing more death, destruction than that was caused by the dropping of the 2 bombs. And she read my essay and thought it was, for a sophomore in high school, there was way more substance there than she was expecting. And she said, have you ever looked at going into engineering? You seem to have a passion for science and technology and a talent for it. And I was like, I have no idea what an engineer is or what an engineer does. And so I kind of latched onto that as a 16-year-old kid. I'm like, engineer, that seems kind of cool. I could be an engineer. Don't know what one does, but yeah, that sounds neat. And that just kind of grew. My passion for science, technology, and various STEM things grew from there. I took an engineering course in high school the following year, my junior year. It was more of a mechanical engineering. You got to get into the shop and actually get your hands dirty and build various things. Like you had to build a self-powered car using whatever you want. You had to build a trebuchet. You got to build those little toys where you spin it and it flies to figure out. You had to build one of those. You had to try to build a boat and see how many quarters it could hold. You did the bridge contest. Everybody remembers doing the bridge contest in high school where you build a bridge and see how much weight it can hold. You did stuff like that. And so my passion for engineering just kind of continued to grow. And like I said, my dad works at a nuclear power plant. And so I kind of started to connect the dots at that point and say, hey, this is, and then around the 2005, 2006 timeframe, or I graduated high school in 2005 to age myself a little bit. And like I said earlier, nuclear new build was the thing. We were going all in. They were talking about peak oil. If you remember around 2005, 2006, it was peak oil. We were going to run out of oil, and gas prices were through the roof. It's kind of similar to what you're seeing now before the economic crash in 2008. And so I was like, yeah, this seems right. I'm going to go to, I'm going to be an engineer. That's what I'm going to do. So I applied to various Big Ten schools as I live in the Midwest. And by chance, funny enough, I applied to Purdue because they didn't require an essay, and I can be lazy when it comes to things like that because I'm not very good at writing. Like I said, my talent is in math and science and technology. Writing was not my strong suit in high school, and Purdue didn't have an entry. You didn't have to write an essay, so I applied there. I got in, and kind of the rest is history. They get you into a general engineering, and I knew I either wanted to do aeronautical engineering because I always wanted to fly. I contemplated going into the Air Force at one point, but civilian life seemed like the better choice for me. And so I looked at between aeronautical and nuclear. They had little introduction classes that you could take your freshman year where it's like, hey, this is kind of what you're looking at. And I chose nuclear at that point, and it just kind of grew from there.
Fair enough. I know a lot of people that applied to schools because they didn't have essay requirements.
I don't think there's any schools left that don't have essay requirements. Yeah, I know they require one now because my brother-in-law went to Purdue years later, and he had to write an essay.
Yeah,
so maybe I just lucked out.
No, I definitely did that also. That's crazy. It's wild because I also had was doing all those like the bridge projects and the different like building things with toothpicks and seeing if you could hold like an egg with it and like doing all those different projects and stuff. But and this is the same reason why I never got into like software stuff either. It's like the concepts really intrigue me, but then once you get down to like actually doing the math or in software engineering, like you could have one extra space and it breaks the whole code. It's like I don't have the mental patience to go find that one space. And that's why I enjoy talking to people like you and like Garrett and like other people like Chris and Tom who are super in that, but it's like the patience that you guys have to just do, like, it's mind-boggling almost to think about. Because I remember taking, let's see, I took multivariable and then differential equations, and I got through those, and I was like, eh. my dad was like, you got through differential equations, you might as well just finish the minor. And I was like, no, dude, it's just like I'm not going past this anymore. Oh, takes a certain type of mind for sure.
Yeah, I could definitely tell you my passion for math ends at the theoretical. So once you pass into the realm of theoretical math, where you're working with dimensions that don't exist, my passion for math drops off pretty quickly at that point. I like to stick to the real world application. I did take a theoretical math course one time at college because I thought it'd be a great idea to take a 500 level, a graduate level math course, and that was just a bad idea for any young viewers out there. If math isn't, if you're not going to be a math major, and solving theoretical equations like in Goodwill Hunting isn't your thing, don't take 500 level math courses. Just don't do it.
No, it's a horrible idea. Garrett is the only person that I know that did that and liked it, and he works for the Navy now doing stuff with like quantum mechanics and lasers, and so that's that's his thing. He was trying to explain to me the math behind teleporting, and I was like, dude, it's like, I like the concept of teleporting, but I'm lost now.
Just tell me it works and beam me up. That's all I want.
Yeah. So actually, now, because this is my cool thing that I remember, is the education I've taken from the podcast. Basically, he had like a piece of paper, and there's an equation that, like, if you curve the paper, you can go from one side and out the other. Theoretically, is how that would work, but to put a human through that, it would like tear you apart, because like the force is, like, it's not possible to actually go through physically right now, but theoretically, I guess there's a certain number of equations that make that work. Yeah,
sounds like the bending of space-time.
Yeah, exactly that. Part of me thinks we shouldn't be messing with that stuff. He's telling me there's like a particle accelerator in Switzerland or something. He was like, yeah, if they screw it up, they'll create a black hole. And I was like, oh, that's good. Well, I guess I'll just be waiting for that then. That or the next Chernobyl, whichever one.
I can tell you there will never be another Chernobyl, because that design reactor doesn't function anymore.
Well, that's a good thing. So walk us through then those sorts of accidents that happen. Like what causes those? You mentioned the peaks and valleys of like the power spikes and stuff, and how you'd want it to be flat. You see, like in TV shows where things go wrong, there's always like a power spike that blows the safety thing off the system, and then everything explodes. It's usually how that works. But how does that actually work in practice? Like when you're sitting in the Bart Simpson control room, or Homer Simpson, Jesus, man, when you're sitting in the control room and looking at all the charts and knobs and lights and stuff, like what's actually going on in there?
No, so that's actually that's a good point. So I can kind of differentiate between the various nuclear accidents that have become famous, and I'll start with Chernobyl. Chernobyl is a RBK reactor, and if you've seen the HBO show,
what's
Chernobyl,
RBK for those listening?
It's just that it is the design. I don't know what it stands for, but it's a graphite moderated reactor. So it's completely different than the type of reactors you think of in the United States. The vessel itself is not submerged in water. It passes tubes through the core that heated up that way. And there's a couple design issues with that. Is that it has a positive power coefficient, which means as it produces more power, the reaction wants to get stronger. As it produces more heat, it wants to get stronger. Where, like in the United States, so as the nuclear chain reaction gets stronger, it wants to continue to make that reaction stronger. All reactors in the United States have a negative power coefficient. So as the nuclear chain reaction increases, the physics behind it want to then decrease that reaction and start shutting the reactor down. It also had to do with the fact that their control rods that they use to control the reaction are graphite tipped. And they were doing a special test to see how long they could power the local area during low power operations during a turbine coast down. And other plants with the same design in the area had said, no, we're not going to do this. This is not a safe test. And this test had been delayed. But if you look back at the politics of Soviet Russia at the time, the plants weren't run by engineers and scientists. They were run by the party. And so you had someone who wanted to make their way into the Communist Party, said, no, we're going to do this test. It was a politician that made the decision, and they weren't challenged from the operators at the station. There were other stations that denied and said, we're not going to do this test. It's not safe. You had someone with political aspirations in this instance, and they said, no, we're going to perform this test. So they had to first bypass safety systems to get to a point where they could perform this test, which is a big no-no. And the test was also delayed. And so what they had to do to get the reactor back to its power level that it needed to be, they actually withdrew their control rods all the way out. And so these graphite tips were now exposed. And what happened was, so they proceeded with the test. And what happened was they started producing too much power. And when they went to insert the control rods, these graphite tips actually had a positive reactivity addition, which means they made the reaction stronger when they went to shut down the reaction. And they went what we call prompt critical. So when you have a nuclear reaction, there are the physics behind it. There are delayed neutrons and there are prompt neutrons. Delayed neutrons occur they're released from the reaction sometime after the initial chain reaction begins. That's actually what allows us to control a nuclear chain reaction, is those delayed neutrons. If you go prompt critical, your power increase happens exponentially. And so when they inserted these graphite tips, they went prompt critical. And so what happens then is your power production went up exponentially in the course of seconds. And they produced so much power that it overpowered the reactor. And what you saw was an explosion based on going prompt critical. And then to worsen that, since it was a graphite moderated core, graphite has a very violent reaction with water. And so then you had the graphite core, the graphite moderator come into contact with water. And then on top of going prompt critical, you end up with a steam explosion. And the power went up so high that, I mean, if you've watched the Chernobyl show on HBO, it blew the top right off. So plants in the United States are not of that design. Regulatory wise, the United States regulates our reactors more than any other country on the planet. We have safety systems in place, and I can tell you the operators like myself, like I said, you're trained 18 months just to get your license and say you are allowed to do this. And most of that training is for accident scenarios that'll never happen. That's what we do in our simulator. They throw stuff. If you think about like the Kobayashi Rube from Star Trek, where they just throw disaster after disaster at you in any hypothetical or unrealistic situation, just to make sure that if that hypothetical happens, you know how to react, you know where to go in your procedures, and you know how to put that plant in a safe condition. And they throw that at us over and over and over and over again. So you're going off muscle memory when these type of things happen. And you'll see, I remember, so when I was a brand new hire, just started as an equipment operator, who finished it takes a year to get qualified as an equipment operator after you get hired. And I had just been qualified, and we took a SCRAM, which is just that. It stands for Safety Control Rod Axeman. And that's just because in the Chicago pile, the University of Chicago, when they first were testing that they could sustain a nuclear reaction, the guy that set it down was actually a guy with an axe sitting there by a rope. So they wanted to insert the control rod to shut down the reaction. He would swing that axe and cut the rope and drop it in. And that's why a SCRAM is called a SCRAM. And it's just kind of a fun story that's gone through the industry, and it's held to that day as Safety Control Rod Axeman. So we actually had a storm that caused electrical perturbation, so we had to shut the plant down. And I remember walking into that control room, and you see lights flashing, and you see the operators in that control room and the supervisor. They go, and they know exactly what to do. The guys are already calling out what they're looking at, what they're doing, and that was just for shutting the plant down. I mean, to me, as a brand new operator, I walked in, I was like, whoa. How you get into the training, and it's automatic, and that to a trained operator at that point, something like that, it's mundane and it's boring, and that's what you want. So if something like that someone walks in and goes, whoa, and these guys are just like, it's a Tuesday, or whatever.
Yeah.
And so one of the best compliments I ever got, my brother is actually in the process of getting his license right now. And he walked into his first simulator set and kind of got a demonstration. And he called me on his way. He was like, Steve, I had no idea what you did, but I have a huge respect for what you do now. It's just to know that these guys are trained to the level, like you think like Navy SEALs are trained for like military action. That's what these operators are trained for as a parallel when it comes to how to run these plants. And then, so I guess the next big one that everybody talks about is Fukushima. And so what you had happen there, and that is a design. We do have reactors like that in the United States, but I can tell you the way they ran those plants in Japan is there's not a perfect parallel to how we run the plants in the United States. Our regulatory body has much more teeth. They will shut you down when they have shut plants down in the past for violations. And the Japanese regulatory body just didn't have those teeth to govern them. And so you had the largest tsunami that that part of the planet has ever seen. And so these plants were rated for whatever size tsunami, I can't remember the size of it. And you had a tsunami that was multiple stronger than that, with a higher wave. And so it broke over their seawall. And really what happened, if you go through it, was the wave that came through and that wall of water actually washed away their diesel generators, because they stored their diesel fuel outside. And so if you think about it, like I could only imagine that would be like here in the Midwest, storing our diesel fuel outside when we can experience tornadoes. I can tell you, like in the Midwest plants, all of our diesel fuel is stored underground in essentially a giant concrete structure. And they had been told, their regulators had said, hey, you need to move it. You need to make your seawall higher, and you need to change the storage location. You're storing your diesel fuel underwater, essentially. And so, but they're like, we'll never see a tsunami that big. Well, we did. And actually the earthquake, the plants all operated phenomenally on the earthquake, a higher than design basis earthquake. And every single one of those plants weathered that earthquake just fine. It was the tsunami that caused the ultimate destruction. And then there were politics involved. From my understanding, they needed to vent their containment, because everybody remembers the explosion that happened at Fukushima. And when you see and what that was a hydrogen explosion. And I'll never forget, I remember Bill Nye the Science Guy was on like MSNBC or CNN or something like that, and he mentioned that like hydrogen is not a byproduct of nuclear power. That's not what happened. And I actually lost a lot of respect for Bill Nye that day, because hydrogen absolutely is a byproduct of a nuclear reaction. It's the hydrolysis of water. And because they were running so long without electricity, what happened was, as you uncover fuel and the temperatures get so high, you end up with a couple of reactions that you actually get hydrogen production from the hydrolysis of water. So you're breaking down those water molecules. And then there's a zircaloy. The fuel rods have zirconium in them. And when zirconium hits high temperatures, the zirconium alloy will release hydrogen. And what really was the case there is they needed to vent their containment to atmosphere. They needed to say, we need to release some level of radiation, and we need to drop this pressure down. We need to get the hydrogen out of containment. And there was a political discussion that I believe went all the way up to the Japanese prime minister. And they were like, no, you're not venting these. You're not going to vent these. And what happened was you had a hydrogen explosion because of that, because they would not vent their containments. And I can tell you all the emergency procedures for the nuclear reactors in the United States all have procedural guidance that if you were to have that accident, like a Fukushima level event, we all have guidance to say, yeah, it's either vent a little bit to the atmosphere or blow the top off, and you're going to vent that thing to atmosphere. You're going to keep the health. Our ultimate goal as a licensed nuclear reactor operator is the health and safety of the public. My company cannot come down and tell me what to do. I have the license.
Yeah.
the senior vice president, the CEO of the company I work for cannot call me and say, you're going to do this, because I can tell him I have the license, I'm going to do this. The governor of Illinois can't come down and tell me you're going to do this, because I'm not,
Because it's
I'm
you.
going to tell him I have the license. The president of the United States, Joe Biden, could call me in the control room and say, I need you to do this. And I can tell Joe Biden politely, sir, I'm a licensed nuclear reactor operator and you are not. And I can tell you that culture is so strong amongst those operators. They all feel a responsibility. Our ultimate responsibility is the health and safety of the public. And that permeates every point of nuclear power because it is unique. And that culture, along with the regulation and the procedures we have in place, separate the nuclear industry in the United States from the nuclear industry in other places of the world where you've seen these accidents happen. All right, yeah. So now that you got that, I kind of got that whole spiel. I can end that little monologue, which is saying that the amount of respect and admiration I have for all the nuclear operators at the various plants in the United States. I can reiterate 1,000 times, they are professionals. They are trained to a level that is beyond comprehension for most people. And that level of event just that you see in Fukushima or Chernobyl, that type of event is beyond the level of reality for plants, the way the plants are run here in the United States. And that does segue pretty nice into the other nuclear accident that everybody always thinks about, especially because now Netflix has a documentary come out, I think tomorrow, on 3 Mile Island. So 3 Mile Island is the one nuclear accident in the United States that people think of. And 3 Mile Island did have a partial core meltdown. And it was actually, it's funny how we kind of did this all out of order. 3 Mile Island was the first nuclear accident. It was the one that happened first. It happened before Chernobyl. And just to put it in perspective, there was not a single fatality from 3 Mile Island. There was no radiation leak to the environment, despite what this Netflix documentary that's going to come out and tell you. Because to me, that's looking at the previews, it looks like a giant hit piece because they couldn't miss out on that money that HBO got from Chernobyl. But 3 Mile Island was a watershed moment for the nuclear industry. So really, what happened was there was a lack of understanding on what the team in the control room was reading. They thought they were reading one thing. They thought they shut off their safety systems. And if you remember back to my talk about Chernobyl, one of the big no-nos is shutting off your safety systems. You don't do it. So they didn't understand one of the readings. They secured their safety systems. They thought their pressurizer level was rising, but in reality, their pressurizer level was dropping. Without getting into a lot of the details, they had a piece of equipment that was out of service. And there was actually a similar site, not that long before that had a similar issue, and they resolved it, no problems. And this watershed moment for the nuclear industry, because there's a uniqueness here that you don't see in a lot of industries, is the various competitors that all run nuclear power plants. They actually talk. We have a self-governing body called INPO, which is the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, and that is actually paid for by all the various utilities that run nuclear power plants. And we all talk. We all share OPEX. We share experiences. We share things that have gone wrong. We benchmark each other. I mean, you don't see a lot of competitors. You don't see Apple go to Google's headquarters and talking about, hey, this is what we're working on. What are you guys working on? And in the nuclear industry, that's what we do. That's extremely commonplace to go look at your competitors. I just did a review for one of my company's competitors last fall, where I went and looked at their outage preparedness and what they were doing. Because we all understand, there's an understanding that if there's ever an accident to that level of Fukushima, Chernobyl, or even another TMI in the United States, the nuclear industry is done. There's no bandwidth for that, and there shouldn't be. Like I said before, that my ultimate priority is the health and safety of the public above anything else when we're operating these units. And so there's just that uniqueness to nuclear power. Nuclear power it's a cliche in the industry, but nuclear power is unique. And that's just one aspect of it. And that's kind of, so that TMI is what caused that. Now, the cooperation between the competitors is just, like I said, it's something you don't see anywhere else. And it's one of the reasons that the nuclear industry in the United States is, in my opinion, the safest in the world. And that actual, that culture has now permeated the rest of the world, because there's also an organization that you may have heard of called WANO, the world. It's the world's version of the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, where there's a similar governing body that that travels all across the world, and we share OPEX with plants in the UK and in France and in Germany. That we all share those OPEXs, those operating experiences, so we can all continue to grow as an industry, because we all understand that there isn't an appetite for that, and like I said, there shouldn't be.
Yeah, that's actually quite comforting to hear that from from an outsider, that it is like that, because the potential consequences for something going wrong for you guys is catastrophic compared to somebody else, like another company just losing money or whatever. It's like, yeah. Well, with all that said, I really appreciate your time and patience through the Zoom was not cooperating with us today. I really appreciate your time. I learned a ton. For those listening, hopefully you guys learned stuff also, and because I've not seen a ton of the nuclear people out and about advertising nuclear stuff. So yeah, anything you want to plug? I don't know. Do you have a book coming out like Chris or
No,
something?
No, I am not as well versed as my much smarter cousin. Both of them. No, I don't have a book or anything coming out like that. I appreciate you having me on. It's the first time I've done something like this. I've had the opportunity to talk to like high schoolers and stuff. I did get to talk to a high school group of high school students in Hawaii one time. It was virtual like this. I didn't get to go to Hawaii, unfortunately. But I've never done anything like this in podcast. And if you ever wanted me back, I'd be more than happy to come back and get any follow-ups. So
yes,
I would look forward to doing this type of thing again. Hopefully it was informative to, like you said, your 20 viewers. Hopefully you get more than 20 viewers. I'm rooting for you.
Yeah.
I'm going to go back. You got one more viewer, because I'm going to go back through your podcast, and I'm going to start listening to them outside of the one that has my cousin in it. So it's been a lot of fun, and I hope we can do it again.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate it. Hopefully next time Zoom will cooperate more, so it doesn't cut you off in the middle of a passionate rant about safety. So
hey, maybe I can be your first and only 3-part series.
Maybe we'll see. Hopefully I'll edit it together and nobody will know, even though we just told everybody. Although they won't have known when they get to that part. They'll know at the end though. All right, before Zoom cuts us off again, I know you got an appointment you gotta run. I appreciate it. With that, guys, we'll talk to you next time. Peace.